If you look at a map today, North and South America look like they've been holding hands forever. But for 60 million years, they were total strangers. South America was an isolated island prison, cooking up nightmare creatures found nowhere else on Earth, like birds that could crush skulls, and sloths the size of elephants. Then a single geological accident changed everything. A bridge formed, the gates opened, and the greatest biological war in history began. But this wasn't just a meeting of continents, it was a massacre that reset the entire planet. For nearly 60 million years, South America was the ultimate introvert of the continental family. Imagine you're standing on the northern coast of what is now Colombia 30 million years ago. You'd look out at the ocean and see absolutely nothing but waves. There was no Panama, no Costa Rica, no land bridge. Just a massive stretch of deep blue water separating the South from the rest of the world. During this time, known to paleontologists as Splendid Isolation, South America became a bizarre evolutionary laboratory. It was basically Australia on steroids. Because nature abhors a vacuum, the ecosystem cooked up its own versions of animals you'd recognize, but with a twist. You didn't have lions, you had Thylacosmilus, a predator that looked exactly like a saber-toothed tiger, but was actually a pouch-carrying cousin of the kangaroo. You didn't have horses, you had litopterns, weird, trunk-nosed grazers that evolved single hooves independently. And the things at the top of the food chain? They weren't even mammals. The apex predators were the terror birds, 8-foot-tall, flightless nightmares with beaks the size of pickaxes that could crush a skull like a grape. Scientists still argue about exactly how isolated the continent really was during the late Eocene. Some think island-hopping monkeys rafted over from Africa way earlier than we thought. But for the most part, this was a closed VIP club. Here's the thing, though. This isolation didn't create a peaceful Eden. It created a fragile house of cards. Because the animals here evolved without facing the fierce, high-stakes competition of the combined northern continents, they were specialized, weird, and totally unprepared for the biological storm gathering just across the water. While the South American animals were busy evolving into oversized guinea pigs and terror birds, the planet itself was preparing to ruin the party. You see, continents don't just sit still. They drift, crash, and grind against each other like bumper cars in ultra-slow motion. And right in the gap between North and South America, a geological pileup of epic proportions was kicking off. Around 15 to 20 million years ago, the Pacific tectonic plates started diving beneath the Caribbean plate. This is classic subduction zone stuff, violently hot, messy, and loud. As the crust melted, it fueled underwater volcanoes that began to rise up from the sea floor. Slowly, these volcanic peaks broke the surface, forming a chain of islands. Imagine a prehistoric archipelago that looked a lot like a rugged version of Hawaii, dotting the gap between the two massive landmasses. Over millions of years, sediment from erosion in North and South America filled in the gaps between these islands. It was nature's version of pouring concrete. By about 2.7 million years ago, though, the dates are heavily contested, the gaps finally closed up completely. The Isthmus of Panama was born. Geologists often talk about this as the most important geological event of the last 60 million years. It's a mainstream fact that this thin strip of land, barely 30 miles wide in some places, totally redirected global ocean currents. But here is a quirky tidbit for you. Before the bridge fully closed, there was likely a shallow water phase where the ocean was only knee-deep for miles. You could effectively wade between continents if you didn't mind the prehistoric sharks. However, scientists still argue furiously about the timeline. The standard model says the bridge closed 3 million years ago, but recent biological studies suggest animals were crossing way earlier, maybe as far back as 20 million years ago. How? But you've been lied to, or at least simplified to. We tend to picture the Isthmus of Panama like a drawbridge slamming down, instantly letting traffic flow. In reality, it was a leaky filter long before it was a solid bridge. Think of it less like a highway opening and more like a difficult obstacle course. The early island chain allowed only the best swimmers or the luckiest rafters to cross. This is why we find ground sloths in North America way before the bridge was technically finished. They didn't wait for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. They island-hopped their way north, millions of years ahead of schedule. The door wasn't locked. It was just really, really hard to open. Once that land bridge solidified around 2.7 million years ago, the biological floodgates didn't just open, they were blown off their hinges. This event is what scientists call the Great American Biotic Interchange, or GABI if you want to sound cool at a dinner party. But let's call it what it really was, an invasion. Imagine you are a toxodon, a native South American grazer roughly the size of a rhino with the face of a depressed hippo. You've spent your whole evolutionary history worrying about terror birds, and maybe the occasional marsupial lion. Suddenly, you look up and see a pack of grey wolves trotting down the isthmus. Behind them are saber-toothed cats, Smilodon, short-faced bears, and weird trunk-swinging elephants called gomphotheres. You have no idea what these things are. You have no evolutionary programming to deal with pack hunters that coordinate their attacks. Spoiler alert, you are going to have a very bad day. The North American away team was absolutely stacked. It included the ancestors of tapirs, peccaries, horses, rabbits, and, wait for it, camels. Here is a quirky tidbit that usually blows people's minds. Llamas and alpacas, the absolute icons of the Andes, are actually North American invaders. They evolved in the plains of North America and migrated south across the bridge. The ones that stayed behind in the US eventually went extinct, leaving their cousins in Peru to become the face of South American tourism. But for the native South American predators, the arrival of the northern carnivores was catastrophic. It was like a professional football team showing up to play against a middle school squad. The placental carnivores from the north, cats, dogs, bears, were generally faster, smarter, and more energy efficient than the metatherian, marsupial-like predators of the south. Take Thylacosmilus, that pouch-carrying saber-tooth we mentioned earlier. It had reigned supreme for millions of years. But once the true saber-toothed cat, Smilodon populator, showed up, Thylacosmilus vanished from the fossil record almost instantly. Scientists still argue whether the cats physically hunted the marsupials to death or simply ate all their food and starved them out. But the result was the same: total replacement. The scale of this takeover is hard to wrap your head around. Today, roughly 50% of the mammal genera in South America are descendants of these North American invaders. The invasion was so successful that if you visit the Amazon rainforest today, you are mostly looking at the descendants of North American immigrants. Jaguars, North American. Tapirs, North American. Deer, North American. The native southern grazers, the weird litopterns and notoungulates, were decimated. They simply couldn't compete with the new herbivores or run away fast enough from the new predators. It was a complete ecosystem reset. Now for the part nobody expects. You might think the North American animals won because they were simply better or stronger, like they had been hitting the gym harder. But that's not quite it. The reason the northern animals were such unstoppable juggernauts comes down to geography. North America wasn't isolated. It had been periodically connected to Asia and Europe via the Bering Land Bridge for millions of years. The animals in the north had been evolving in a massive, connected, world-island arena. They had survived competition against the best predators from Africa, Europe, and Asia. They were battle-hardened veterans of the toughest evolutionary league on Earth. South America, on the other hand, had been in solitary confinement. Its animals had evolved in a low-competition environment. When the bridge opened, it wasn't a fair fight. The northern animals brought millions of years of global warfare experience to a continent that had never seen a true placental carnivore. It wasn't just an exchange of species, it was a collision of two completely different operating systems, and the more updated one won by a landslide. So, was this a complete shutout? Did the South American team just roll over and die? Not exactly. There was a reverse commute, but it was a much smaller, weirder group of pioneers. While the North sent an army of efficient killers and grazers, the South sent, well, a motley crew of oddballs. The most metal of these immigrants was Titanis walleri, a descendant of those South American terror birds. Imagine an ostrich on steroids, with claws capable of disemboweling a horse, sprinting through the scrublands of what is now Florida and Texas. For a brief window, this was the only large predator in North America that wasn't a mammal. It looked at the wolves and cats and basically said, "Cute teeth, watch this." Then there were the ground sloths. These guys were massive, some the size of elephants, and they were surprisingly successful. We found their fossils as far north as Alaska. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, yes, the founding father, was so obsessed with a fossil claw found in West Virginia that he told explorers Lewis and Clark to keep an eye out for living giant lions. It turned out to be a giant sloth, Megalonyx. But you can't blame him for hoping. And of course, we have the modern survivors. The nine-banded armadillo and the Virginia opossum. These are the scrappy underdogs of the gaby. The opossum in particular is a biological marvel. It's a slow, pouch-wearing marsupial with 50 teeth that survives by eating trash and pretending to be dead when things get scary. Yet, it managed to colonize the entire eastern United States, while the mighty saber-tooths went extinct. Scientists still argue about why the southern migration was so much less effective than the northern one. The leading theory is the climate filter. The Isthmus of Panama was a tropical gateway. Northern animals adapted to cold climates could handle the warmth of the tropics. It's easier to shed a coat than grow one instantly. But the tropical South American animals hit a thermal wall when they tried to move into the temperate north. They just couldn't handle the winter. Here's the thing though, we call this event the Great American Interchange, which sounds like a polite, mutual swapping of gifts. Like, I'll give you a horse, you give me a sloth. But if you look at the numbers, it was a biological scam. The exchange was drastically uneven. North American mammals moving south diversified into a massive array of new species. They exploded in population. South American mammals moving north mostly fizzled out. Aside from the opossum, armadillo, and porcupine, almost all the southern immigrants eventually went extinct in North America. It wasn't a trade, it was a hostile takeover. The North American ecosystem absorbed the few southern species that could hack it, while the South American ecosystem was fundamentally rewritten by the invaders. If you look at a pie chart of South American mammal diversity today, it's not a 50-50 split. It's dominated by the invaders. The native weird fauna, the marsupial predators, the heavy grazers, the terror birds, didn't just lose territory, they were erased from existence. While the animals were fighting their turf war on land, the Isthmus of Panama was quietly pulling the trigger on something much bigger. It didn't just connect two continents, it severed two oceans. For eons, water flowed freely between the Atlantic and Pacific, keeping the global temperature relatively mild. But when that door slammed shut, the ocean currents were forced to reroute. The warm water that used to flow into the Pacific was deflected northward, creating what we now know as the Gulf Stream. This sounds like a good thing, sending warm water toward Europe to keep it cozy. But here is the thing though. Climatology is full of paradoxes. That pump of warm water brought moisture into the high Arctic. More moisture meant more snow. And because the Earth was already cooling down, that snow didn't melt in the summer. It piled up layer by layer until it formed massive ice sheets. The closing of the Panama Bridge effectively kick-started the Pleistocene ice ages. It turned the planet into a freezer. This is a mainstream scientific theory, but here is a quirky tidbit. This change in currents also made the Atlantic Ocean much saltier than the Pacific. The Atlantic salinity conveyor is what powers the global ocean circulation today. If the isthmus hadn't closed, the oceans might have become stagnant, which would have been a disaster for marine life. Scientists still argue about the precise timing. Some say the ice ages would have happened anyway due to dropping CO2 levels, and that Panama was just the final nudge. But there is no denying the correlation. Now for the part nobody expects. This geological traffic jam might be the only reason you are watching this video right now. When the isthmus closed and the world cooled, it didn't just freeze the north, it dried out the tropics. Specifically, it sucked the moisture out of East Africa. The lush rainforests where our ape ancestors lived began to shrink, turning into open savannas. Our ancestors were faced with a choice: die in the shrinking trees or come down to the ground, stand on two legs and start walking to find food. The formation of the Isthmus of Panama likely triggered the environmental pressure that forced hominids to evolve bipedalism and bigger brains. So, when you look at a map and see that thin, squiggly line connecting the Americas, don't just see a land bridge. See the lever that controlled the climate, killed the monsters, and created mankind. Nature works in domino effects. One shift in tectonic plates millions of years ago destroys a continent's ecosystem, freezes the planet, and forces a random species of ape to invent the wheel. If that bridge had never formed, South America would still be an island of monsters, and we might still be swinging from trees. Hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next epoch.